Here we go. Hi, everyone.
Hi, welcome back.
Welcome back for our second season, and we are really excited with that.
Mhm.
Right, Anna?
Yeah, so we have already like a list of amazing speakers, and so compared to so we have new topics and new amazing stuff to learn this workshop series. And
Yeah.
also we have a news that we are going to have a collaborator with us
Yeah.
to help us with the workshop, and also like she will be leading as well with us some of the workshop. And so we can add her. Hello, Claire.
Hello, Claire.
Hello. So
Welcome
I
to
guess,
our group.
yeah, I'm excited to help out a bit.
Awesome. Anna, we always do that. We always forget to introduce ourselves.
Yeah, it's
So
true.
nice to meet you. If you are new here, I'm Felipe Matias from University of Wisconsin.
And I'm Anahita Marrano from University of Massachusetts, Boston. And Claire is from,
I am from Agriculture Canada out of Ottawa.
yes.
Awesome. So for this next season, three of us we're gonna be sharing this workshop series, and we're gonna be here to give all support necessary for everyone. And before we starting, subscribe here in our channel, some here to start following what we are doing and uh, receive information when we starting a new broadcast.
Yes.
Okay,
So let's start with the presentation.
exactly.
Oh, what we heard. So I think like probably many of the peoples that are attending the workshop, they know us, but for who is new, we are going just to explain what is PhenomeForce and what we do. So PhenomeForce, we started this platform 1 year ago, actually, because 1 year ago this pandemic started. But right before the pandemic, me, Felipe, and Claire, we met at Phenome, the conference about high throughput phenotyping, and this all started. So me and Felipe, we decided to found this platform because in order to allow people that are just starting to use high throughput phenotyping, but also like people that they are already using it since a lot of time, but they want to connect with more people and learn new technology. So PhenomeForce aim to provide all these knowledge and tools. We focus mostly on open source tools for for phenomics, but I mean, like, we are open to all possibilities. So first of all, we try to provide free training, and this is why we organize this online free workshop. But of course, we want to empower early career researchers. So many of our speakers are postdoc or they are graduate students. And of course, we want to connect people. So we want also, so how you can connect with us and how you can know about us. So first of all, we have a website. Here you see the first link that can connect you to website, but I think you have more description below the video that you are just following. We are on Twitter where we share our news, and so you can follow us there if you want to know what we are organizing at the next events. We have our YouTube channel where you are actually watching the workshops, and you can also see that we already did the first season last year, and so you can go back and rewatch anything that you like. You can send us email if you have any suggestion about which topic you want to cover, and like if you want to be also a speaker, so let us know. And of course, we have also a Slack environment. So for who is not familiar with Slack, Slack is a platform that allows people to connect. There are many channels that we created based on the topics in phenomics. So you can join any of the channels that you prefer. Of course, if you want to join this environment, please send an email to phenomeforce@gmail.com, and we will add you to the list of people that are part of this environment. And we ask you to introduce yourself into the introduction channel. Of course, we also strongly suggest you to send us feedbacks in the suggestion channel. And we also promote events and promote job offers. And so talking about, so the workshop series, as I say, last year in fall, we had our first workshop series. It was about open source tools for data analysis in phenomics. We had like 10 workshops and they were great. We had a great attendance from across the world. But if you want, and if you are new here, you can go back and rewatch them and see like anytime you want. And so talking about the workshop series that we just started, I will give the word to Philippe.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Yeah, we are getting great on that introduction, right?
Yes.
after 10 times. Well, guys, after the feedback from the workshop series 1, which is this one here, so please go there and have your time to watch all the great presentations that we had. We, based on the feedback from that, we decided to come with the second season in low-cost phenotyping platforms, which sometimes can be kind of challenging for some groups have the platform. So right now we have really amazing researchers that is work on that. And our workshop series start today, April 9th, and go from the next 9 weeks. So here is the agenda for our next 9 workshop series. We have scheduled into June 4th. If you are interested to be part of this workshop or the next season, please send a message to us in the Slack channel or email. We're gonna try to schedule something or and contact you with more information. Here is the registration link for our workshop series, this one, right, in setting up low-cost phenotyping platforms. If you didn't sign up yet, please sign up. The registration link is right here in the description, and we need that information to plan the next season, next year. And with this, our first workshop today, it's amazing. We are going to start with Raspberry Pi. As you guys know, Raspberry Pi have been using for many different applications, for games. The speaker is going to talk more about that, but also to develop plant phenotyping platforms, and that's really great. This is the official website, also is here in the description. The speakers today, they share with us this list with is the equipments or tools that we're going to need for the workshop today. And as you can see, there is the Amazon link for each one of these tools. And also the link for this table is here in the description, so go there. And also feel free to make any questions for the speakers during the presentation. So with this, I want to like to introduce Jeff Barry and Noah Fahlgren from Donald Dunford Plant Science Center. Today, they're going to present about getting started with Raspberry Pi. Is our introductory workshop today, and that's going to open the door for many other workshops that's coming on the next Fridays. So welcome.
Yeah, I want also to add that if you guys have any question during the workshop, you can write them live on the chat on YouTube, and we will interrupt the speakers to answer your question. And welcome Noah and Jeff to the screen.
Hi guys.
Hello, glad to be here.
Yeah, so if you guys want to start sharing the screen or the presentation, then we can start.
And again, guys, this is online and internet, so many devices. If someone of us lost the connection, please stay there. We're gonna give our best to come back in time. Okay?
Yes.
There we go.
Well, good luck, guys, with the workshop, and enjoy it.
Yeah, we're gonna be right here. Just let me know if you need anything.
Great, thanks. Let me know if anything stops working. I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then Jeff will get into the hands-on portion. But if Jeff, if you want to add anything to what I'm saying, feel free. So I'm Noah Fahlgren. I'm the director of the data science group at the Danforth Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Jeff is also in the data science group. as a senior data scientist. Both of us have been working with phenotyping technologies at the PhenomeForce Center for quite a few years now, and both of us have been interested in affordable phenotyping technologies like Raspberry Pi that we talked about today. So just a real brief overview of what we'll cover. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to affordable phenotyping technologies, and Raspberry Pi in particular, and then Jeff's going to show you how to do some basic configuration of a Raspberry Pi, so installing an operating system, and getting a network set up and things like that. And then he'll cover how to install a camera module and take pictures with code, essentially. You should have received a link to a Google Doc, which has the materials for today. There's a shortened link here in case you need to write it off the screen. I also posted it in the YouTube chat, if that's easier. So before we talk about affordable phenotyping, I want to talk about automated plant phenotyping platforms, because that's often where you hear a lot of talk about plant phenotyping is large automated facilities at some universities and institutes. So this, just as an example, is the Bellwether Phenotyping Facility at the PhenomeForce Center. So it's a combined growth chamber that holds about 1,200 plants at a time, and they each are on an individual carrier, so they can move through the facility on a conveyor belt system, and they go through 3 imaging cabinets. Well, only 2 these days, but we can do RGB imaging and then near infrared imaging. And both these cabinets have 2 cameras, so we can do side view and top view imaging. So these facilities are great, and I don't want to, as we talk about affordable phenotyping, I don't want to. My intention is not to disparage large phenotyping facilities, because they are useful. So they do have typically a high amount of automation. So for the Bellwether facility, once we load the plants, as someone doing an experiment, we often don't have to think about the experiment again until the end, unless we're plucking some samples off of it. So the system will water the plants automatically and more or less take care of them. So that's amazing. They often, depending on the setup, have good environmental control. So our system is completely automated in terms of environment. The other thing is these kind of platforms are typically built like of many integrated systems, and so you can have multi-sensor data collection. So in our system, like I said, we're collecting the color, camera, image data, near infrared imaging, plus environmental data, the amount of water added to each plant. So it's a nice integrated system from that perspective. The other thing that these kind of systems will typically come with is support. And that could mean both support from the company that built it, so in our case, Limited, but also just facility support. So we have a great facilities team that operates the system, so that people like me don't have to think about fixing parts that break and all those kind of things.
Noah?
Yes.
Just a second. Could you speak a little bit loud? For your microphone is a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hang on just one second. Let me make sure.
Yeah,
I
I
just
just
wanted to make sure I was using the right microphone. But I will try to speak louder.
Yeah, there's just a little bit of background coming through. That's all. I thought maybe when the feed started, it switched to your laptop internal.
okay.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. There's no sound here.
Awesome. Thank
Oh,
you.
right. So the cons though of a system like the Bellwether facility, the big one of course is cost, right? So it costs multiple millions of dollars to build something like that, and so that's not accessible to everyone. Another issue is accessibility of the facility itself. So only one group, more or less, can use it at a time. Experiments are reasonably long; they could last up to a month. So there's kind of there's a queue for people to get their experiments into the system. So you kind of have to wait your turn to do an experiment. You can't just do it whenever you're ready to do an experiment. And then another issue can be customizability. So in our case, the Lemnitech system is kind of an enclosed system. We can't, we could go through the company to add to it, but we can't just add things to it ourselves whenever we want. So we kind of have limited ability to add new types of sensors or other things to it. So when we, the sort of common, I think, solution to this problem is you want to do plant phenotyping, but one of those negative aspects of sort of the more automated facilities kind of prevents you from doing it as frequently as you'd like, or in the environment you'd like, and so a lot of people for the past 5 to 10 years have started using low-cost computers or microcontrollers to build platforms for plant phenotyping. And this could look like a lot of different things, including building your own kinds of automation. But what we're really going to talk about today is just automating imaging itself. But this is just a small snapshot of the different kinds of platforms that exist. We're going to talk about Raspberry Pi today, but there's a workshop at the end of the series on Arduino microcontrollers. So these are the two probably most popular systems out there. But a lot of the chip manufacturers make other kinds of platforms. So they're Intel Galileos, an Intel-based single board computer. NVIDIA makes one for sort of lower cost GPU type computing. BeagleBoard is another popular one, and then there's many, many more. And there's also many variations on each of these. It's kind of endless, and really just comes down to like the set of features you're looking for. So in our case, we use Raspberry Pi a lot, and the main reason is that it's a complete system on a chip computer. I'm not really going to talk about the distinction between this and a microcontroller, but the short version is a microcontroller is not really a full computer. It's just a board that lets you control circuits. Raspberry Pi has this capability as well. These pins that you can see on the top, they're called GPIO pins. This allows you to connect external sensors and circuits to the Raspberry Pi, and so this makes it an electronics prototyping platform. But besides that, it's a complete computer with CPU and memory and peripheral ports that you'd find on a typical computer. So there are people out there that use it as an affordable desktop computer platform. For our purposes, our interest in it in plant phenotyping is as an imaging platform because it's capable of being used as a camera module. There's a camera module add-on that can be plugged into the board, and so you have a full computer with an operating system plus a camera, and that allows you to do time-lapse imaging by scheduling when or how often images are taken. I guess the other thing I would note here too is that the Raspberry Pis are configured for networking, so they have Ethernet ports, most of the models. We'll talk about the differences later. And they also, in one way or another, have wireless networking as well, both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, depending on the model. So when we use Raspberry Pi for plant phenotyping platforms, in our use case, the typical setup is to use a Raspberry Pi computer and camera, typically over about one tray of plants. But we can put many of these in growth chambers to cover many trays at a time. So just like the larger platforms, we can have automated data collection. We can control the temporal resolution of imaging. So we could, if we wanted to, image about as fast as an image per minute, but you can configure that. So more typically, we would take like an image an hour. I've seen all sorts of things. We are collecting data on multiple plants simultaneously, and this really just depends on, in this case, this is a tray of 17 plants. Obviously, it just depends on how big you want your pots to be and how much space you want between plants and things like that. But this single camera module, we can build an automated image collection system for about $100 US. And if you want to read more details about some of our protocols for this, there's a paper by Jose Tovar and Steve Hoyer from the PhenomeForce Center. The Raspberry Pi also sells a modified camera module called the No-IR camera. This is the same as the other camera, it just is missing the infrared cut filter that cameras typically have. And this allows you to do infrared imaging. So in this case, the Newsonow lab at the PhenomeForce Center is interested in diurnal plant growth. And so they're doing 24-hour imaging under infrared light so they can see the plants in both the lights on and lights off times of day at the same level. They describe this in a paper. And Malia and Jose will be doing a workshop a little bit later in the series where they will probably talk about their imaging platform and what they do with it in more detail. But just to show you the kinds of things you can set up with Raspberry Pi at relatively low cost. This is an example of where they have two pairs of walk-in growth chambers, and they have an array of Raspberry Pi computers over the trays. So in total, there's 144 cameras between these two growth chambers. And with these size trays, that means they're imaging almost 2,600 pots simultaneously. And in their configuration, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, they're using a power over Ethernet configuration to kind of help with the cable management, despite what it looks like, because there's still a lot of cables. But this means that they can do a lot of setup. And again, I'm not doing this to disparage high-throughput phenotyping platforms, but just to show that affordable platforms can be very high throughput. So the Bellwether system, again, holds 1,040 plants that we can image once per day. And in this configuration, we can do 3 RGB images per plant per day. So that's 3,420 images of each plant per day. That's about 17 gigabytes a day. With Malia's 2 chambers, we can image, again, almost 2,600 plants, 8 to 16 times per day, because we can only do this with the lights on, with the typical camera. That's 1 RGB image per tray per hour, which is a little over 2,000 images per day, or about 10 gigabytes. But because there's multiple plants in each tray, that means there's over 36,000 images of individual plants per day. So the throughput is actually quite high, and we're imaging the plants simultaneously versus in a serial configuration in the Bellwether facility where we have to move the plants on a conveyor system. Now, obviously, on the contrast, the Raspberry Pi growth chambers don't have like full watering as well as the Bellwether facility, so we use that. It's only a single camera from the top view, so we only have that one view of the plant on the side view imaging, like the Bellwether facility. I don't have it on here, but we're also only doing RGB imaging. There's no NIR imaging. If you were talking about other facilities, you'd also be missing things like spectral or thermal or all sorts of other kinds of sensors. So, it's not that any one system is better than the other, but just showing you can do a lot with a Raspberry Pi-based system in your growth. So in our case, to analyze this data, we developed an open source image analysis platform called PlantCV. The purpose of this workshop is not to talk about this part, but I just want to introduce this briefly. PlantCV is a Python package, and you can build custom image analysis workflows using a set of modular tools. I'm just going to point out our website and mention that we have embedded there a PhenomeForce workshop we did from last fall, on using PlantCV, which you can find there, and of course you can also find it on the PhenomeForce YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that, I recommend maybe rewatching that. We also did a workshop that's very relevant to what I'm talking about today during the NAPPN 2021 meeting. Unfortunately, you had to register for that meeting to be able to see the recording of that workshop currently, but we're hoping to make that available online soon. So with PlantCV, we start with an individual image from a Raspberry Pi camera. And then we can identify each of the plants individually. So we can also identify, we can label which pixels come from each plant. And then once we do that, we can measure things about the plant's shape and size and color and all sorts of things. And this was described in the PlantCV version 2 paper. And I'm not going to talk about the details of this, but I just want to show you that, again, despite Raspberry Pi systems being affordable phenotyping systems, that doesn't mean that we can't do some pretty cool things with that data. And so I'm just showing some newer developments from some folks in the group. Jorge, who's in both my group and Malia's group, is developing a method to address the problem of segmenting plants once they start overlapping each other. So he's developed a method, a technique to do 3D spatial and temporal propagation of plant labels over time. And so he can take these time series image stacks, and then under normal PlantCV, you would identify all these plants as one plant because they all overlap each other, like they're all connected. But by propagating labels over time, you can separate the individual plants even after they start overlapping. And then Hudan Yu Sheng, who's in Malia's group, is also working on a cool aspect of this where once we identify the individual plants, we use a deep learning method called mask-CNN to segment the individual leaves of the plants. So first you can see the a single plant growth time series. Then we do the segmentation with mask-CNN. And what you'll notice is that the leaf labels change over time kind of randomly, and that's because mask-CNN labels the leaves arbitrarily. And so there's not consistency between one image and the next. So she's developed a method to uniquely label each leaf over time by linking them, and so you get a consistent, the color represents that consistent labeling over time. And so that lets us track the size and shape of individual leaves. Okay, so that was just a real brief introduction on the kinds of things we use Raspberry Pis for. And so we're going to turn to this Google Doc, and Jeff is going to start walking us through how to set up a Raspberry Pi. And we're hoping that this is a primer for the rest of the series where other groups will be talking about using Raspberry Pis to collect data.
Yeah, all right. That's just I wouldn't say that's a brief introduction. There's just a lot of different things you can do with Raspberry Pis, and it just really depends on what you want to do with it. There was near-infrared imaging that Noah showed. That's a non-trivial task to get that set up. Even setting up a top view camera in a growth chamber, also pretty non-trivial. You'll find out that if you use tape or something, and all of a sudden you have really high humidity, Pis fall down, and they don't like to stay in place. But just like Noah mentioned, we're going to talk about a Google Doc that we've prepared for you guys. That's an introduction to just getting started with a Raspberry Pi. So you've got your components, and we're just going to spend some time to figure out how to connect them all and get them all working. So if you follow that link, this should take you to a Google Doc, which I'm going to share my screen so we can walk through it together. So it should take you to this Google Doc right here. And what we need to do at the very beginning is download the operating system if you haven't already. So really quickly, I'm just going to scroll down to get this link right here. If you click this link, you'll start the download automatically for the very latest version of Raspbian OS. So they call it the desktop replacement operating system. So let's start this download now. It takes, depending on your network connection, anywhere from 5 to 6 minutes. And then once we get it actually downloaded, this is a zip file. We have to unzip it. And when you unzip it, it's very big. So just a fair warning that when you unzip it, it'll take about 9 gigabytes of space. So just
sorry, Jeff, can you increase a bit the window of the Google form? Like the bigger, because so people can read better the text.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah.
Zoom in, yes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna bring it down here like this then.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's better. Okay, yeah, so this link right here, that's the one we want to follow. And this will take you to a zip file, and it'll start downloading. And again, it takes about, depending on network connection, sometime between 5 and 6 minutes. When you unzip this file, it is quite large. On my computer, it's 8.6 gigabytes. So we have about, I'm going to try to stall for about 5 minutes just in case anyone's trying to do this live. And I'm going to just sort of go through what this document is. So it's a really long document. This is based on a Raspberry Pi introduction I did for a different lab, I guess last year. So getting started, there's an official Raspberry Pi link. This is their website. They have a lot of really great information there. It's a really large community base. They have forums there. And anything you could basically possibly want to do with a Raspberry Pi, I almost promise you someone else has done it already. And the Raspberry Pi community is very open. So they share a lot of details, intricate details on their systems, and are very helpful in terms of question and answer in the forums themselves. So I highly recommend going there and just exploring for your own purposes. There's also GitHub repositories that are vast in numbers that talk about how to use Raspberry Pi for specific applications and so on. So really, Google is your friend here. I almost promise you, whatever you want to do, someone else has probably at least thought of it, if not have already done it. Maybe not exactly to what you want to do, but at least get you a really good start. Okay, so to get Raspberry Pi working, you have to have the components. So for the very minimum requirement number of components here for our session today, just the setup and getting the camera started, we have to have Raspberry Pi. So what we're going to go through is a tutorial that's sort of modified around the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus and the Raspberry Pi 4. So the 4 is the newest version, and it comes in multiple flavors. In the cost, it ranges anywhere between about $40 all the way up to about $90. And the differences between them are going to be based on the memory that's on the board. So commonly, you'll have like 2 gigabytes. That's going to be their lowest cost option. And in the middle, you can have 4 gigabytes. I think there's a 6 gigabyte version, and the largest you go is 8 gigabytes. That's the $80 version. The idea behind having that much memory on board, which is kind of uncommon for microcontrollers and microprocessors, is that it's advertised as a desktop replacement. And in fact, the Raspberry Pi 4s, they actually support dual monitor 4K support, which is kind of incredible. And that was one of the big things they boasted about from going from the Raspberry Pi 3 to the 4. And then lastly, they have something called a Raspberry Pi Zero W. So it's a chip. I don't actually have one here, but it's about the size of a piece of gum. Really, really small. But it does support an operating system, not the one that we'll work with today, but it also supports a camera. So for spaces that are really confined, particularly like near-infrared chambers, which I've used, we have like a little dark box. We put in a little Raspberry Pi Zero in there. It's about the size of a stick of gum. We have and it's controlled externally, so we can take pictures in the dark. It's really great, really cheap. The Raspberry Pi Zero Ws are only about $10. And the W is for the Wi-Fi support. They do make Zero without the Wi-Fi support, and that's only $5. It's kind of incredible. So we're going to go through a 3B Plus 4 tutorial. So you have to have a board. And depending on which Raspberry Pi you get, you need specific components. And that's what's really mentioned down here in this component link. So if we go there, these are all the links that was displayed earlier. So depending on what Raspberry Pi you have, the Raspberry Pi 4 section here, the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus section right here. The major differences are the cases that you can get, and more specifically, the power supply and the way you connect video are very different. So the Raspberry Pi 4 uses a USB-C connection, so it's the really modern connection. And the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, it uses a micro USB. So it's a really common thing for, actually with the phone upgrades over time, things were like Androids were using USB-C now, and then previously they were using micro USB, and it just sort of transitioned pretty much at a similar time. But the prices for these things are a little bit different between them. The Raspberry Pi 4 generally runs a little bit more in terms of components versus the 3B Plus. But this is all the different things you need to consider when we're working through this tutorial. So we need a board, and the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, $35. The Pi 4 with, I think, 4 gigabytes memory, that's now $62. Cases, power cord, and you need a way to connect a monitor. So additionally, just having the board, if you don't have a case right now, that's totally fine. They run just fine, just on a kitchen table or whatever you have it on. You need to have a keyboard and mouse, USB keyboard and mouse, plug it in. And we also need a monitor. So the default output from both Raspberry Pis 3 and 4 are HDMI. So the 3B Plus supports full HDMI port, and the big change to the 4B, so that they can have dual monitor support, because those things are really quite large, they have to knock down the size of the USB port, or the HDMI port itself. So now they're using a mini HDMI. See, there's 2 mini HDMI ports on the board. So you need a way to convert that mini HDMI to probably full HDMI that is supported by your monitor. So it's just an additional component that you require, and this is an additional level cost. Okay, So now you have your components, the board, keyboard, mouse, and ways to connect to your monitor. The last thing we have to have is SD cards. So the hard drive of a Raspberry Pi is an SD card. So on your laptop, you have this big flat disk, usually some sort of a solid state or maybe a rotating disk. It's a hard drive. The hard drive for a Raspberry Pi is an SD card. And that's where we're going to put our operating system. And that's where like your normal home directory with your documents, pictures, videos, and so on, that's where it's going to be stored. It's going to be stored in that little chip. So in order for you to access an SD card, you have to have an SD card reader. Let's see if I can pull up mine. We like to use SanDisk. So there are other SD cards out there like PNY, and I think there's another one too that's really common in general stores. But SanDisk is tried and true, the best memory card that we have at least tested in terms of longevity and just performance as a whole. So I highly recommend SanDisk Reader and SanDisk Card. And minimum size for SD card, I would highly recommend getting at least a 16 gigabyte. Because I already showed you the size of the operating system is about 9 gigabytes. So if you get an 8 gig card, you might have a little room left to spare, but probably not likely anymore. So a 16 gigabyte card is probably the minimum. I am going to be running on a 32 gigabyte card. Okay, so that's the memory. That's where your hard disk is, and that's where everything's going to be happening. Last thing we need for our session today is a camera. So Noah mentioned that there's like several different versions of camera modules that connect to Raspberry Pi. They all range in price as well. So up to about, I think 2 years ago, there was a Raspberry Pi module called the version 1. It's a really great camera module, but they upgraded it quite significantly to a version 2. The version 1 camera was priced at about $20, and the version 2 camera, I believe, is maybe slightly more expensive at like maybe $25. And I believe a year and a half ago, they released their really fancy version of the camera, and that's at about $50. The really cool thing about the new fancy camera is that you can get detachable lenses, and you can attach whatever lens you want whenever you want. It's a really cool system. I've never personally used it, but I have seen images from it, at least on the internet. They're really high quality. So there's the different cameras that are available to you. Just pick one, and we can work with it as long as it's connected to the board. Okay, so that's going over the different links here and what we need to get started for today. We need a board. If you have a case, you can use it, but we need a way to connect to a monitor. So that's going to be HDMI cable. We also need, if you have a Raspberry Pi 4, you need a mini HDMI to HDMI converter. And we need SD card and an SD card reader. So those are the minimum components for today, in addition to a camera. So those are the minimum components we need for today. So hopefully by now, if you have started the download for the operating system, hopefully it's completed, and you'll have a zip file. So what we need to do is just unzip it. So you'll get to a spot where you have this image, this .img document here. It should be quite large. And once we're here, we have to start another download. So once we have this operating system on our laptop, that's not helpful. We have to get it on an SD card. Now, a lot of people think that you can just copy paste this thing onto an SD card. Sorry, that's not going to cut it. It has to be a special way to upload or download this thing to the SD card in a specific way. And the way we're going to do this is, again, with our most tried and true method, because Raspberry Pi offers a couple different options. However, one of those options is not the way we like to do it. We like to use a program called Etcher. So we get down here, there's a link for Etcher right there. So when we follow this, it'll take you to their website right here. It's a really great website. And all we have to do is download the program that fits your operating system. So I don't know if you guys can tell, I'm using Ubuntu here. So I would have to install the Linux version here. But if you're using Windows, I recommend this one right here. If you're using Mac, just click here. It's a standalone standalone application. And when we launch it, it's a really quick download. When we launch it, we get a window like this. So once we have our image downloaded and uncompressed, we're going to press this Flash from File button. I'm going to click this image right here, say Open. And then if you have your SD card in your SD card reader and plugged into your laptop. Hopefully, your laptop or machine will identify where it should go, because it's going to automatically identify SD cards. And that's going to be this spot right here. I have mine plugged in. And all you have to do is press flash. So when we do this, you have to have some sort of authorization. And once it gets going, it takes about 7 minutes to flash. So flashing is the idea of copy pasting, but in this special manner where it's, because images are sort of packages of files. And if you just copy paste the image to the drive, it doesn't recognize it as all the different subdirectories inside the image. This flashing will make sure all of those things inside the image are copy pasted correctly. So this whole process of using Etcher is doing this copy paste of all these individual files in the image. And then once the image is actually copied to your SD card, it runs a check. That's a really nice thing about Etcher, is it runs a check for you to make sure it copied correctly. This is using usually MD5 sums. It's just a checksum, just to make sure everything that was on your image on your laptop or your machine got transferred correctly to your SD card. So this is taking me a little while, but it should go relatively quick for you guys. I'm going to guess about 7 minutes total. And once we have this flashed to the SD card, then we can remove it from your laptop or your machine, and we're going to put it into your Raspberry Pi. There's a little slot right below the camera port in your Raspberry Pi. And it's a tiny little slot, and we're going to slide the SD card in there. We're going to have the pins, or you'll see the gold strips on your SD card. That's going to be facing the board. So when you plug it in, you don't want to see those strips. We don't want to see those strips. So that's going to be where we're going to, it has to be read in that way. It looks like Noah's here.
Hey, Jeff, did you want to, I have some slides about Raspberry Pi models. I don't know, do you want to talk about that while this is flashing, or?
Oh, yeah, sure. That's a great idea. So this is flashing here. It's going to take another 9 minutes or so. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can talk about more Raspberry Pi stuff.
And you can feel free to stay on here and talk about any of this part that you want. I think Jeff really actually already covered a lot of the important details here. And so, yeah, Jeff, definitely chime in. But this is just showing an overview of all of the different models of Raspberry Pis that they've created over the years. It looked to me like last night I could still buy any of them all the way back to kind of the original Pi 1s. Although there's not really much reason to, because here's them listed with their prices from adafruit.com. And so you can see that, well, they've discounted the oldest ones a bit. This used to be $35, but basically you can get a newer one for the same price as sort of what the older ones cost. So I'd probably stick with at least the 3s, if not the 4, you know, if you're kind of use one of these full-size ones. But Jeff also mentioned the Pi Zeros, which are the smaller, lower power ones that are good options as well for this. They all work with the camera module, so from a camera point of view, you can't go wrong really. One consideration for these is networking though. So some of them have Ethernet and some have Wi-Fi built in. So I marked with the green check marks the ones that have built-in Wi-Fi. So if you want to use wireless networking, those are good options. The bottom row do not have wireless networking. So we never use the Pi Zero without the W because it doesn't have any built-in networking capabilities. The older ones, well, the Pi 2 Model B and the 1B Plus both have Ethernet only, but you could add Wi-Fi by attaching a USB Wi-Fi module. This is like a real specialty thing, but I mentioned Malia's group uses power over Ethernet. So that's where the Ethernet cable delivers network, but also power And some of the newer Pis are compatible with power over Ethernet switches. It does require a special network connection, or a special network switch or router. That makes it more expensive, but you can then have fewer cables going to your Pis. So they all also require like some type of an adapter. I believe Malia is using this this Pi 3 Model B, and she uses a third-party adapter on the Ethernet cable to make that work. For the Pi 3 Model B Plus and the Pi 4 Model B, they sell a chip that sandwiches on top of the Pi called a PoE hat, and that's required to use power over Ethernet for those. We've already really talked about the cameras, but I don't know if you can still get the V1 cameras, but they were 5 megapixel cameras. The V2 cameras are now 8 megapixels, and both cost $30. And the difference, again, here is that the green colored one is a standard color camera, so it'll take RGB images. The no IR camera also takes RGB images, but it doesn't have the infrared cut filter that normal cameras have. And this is a filter that has a wavelength cut filter that prevents any wavelengths above red light. I think it's about 640 or 670 nanometer cut filter. So because it doesn't have that filter, it's sensitive to light up to 1,000 nanometers. And so if you take pictures with this camera like under normal lighted conditions, you'll end up with a picture that looks kind of pink because it's oversaturated in the red channel. The example I showed of infrared imaging, the Newsonow group puts a visible light cut filter in front of this camera so that it can only see light above 700 nanometers. And then it becomes an infrared camera. You can do other things with this, like build a sort of NDVI kind of camera, things like that. I will note, if you're going to do infrared imaging, though, you do need an infrared light source. And then the newer camera system, and for me, I'm like Jeff, I haven't tried the system yet. I've just seen a few examples of people using it, but it's a $50 camera. It's 12.3 megapixel sensor. It's compatible with C and CS mount lenses. So that's an additional cost because the lens is something that comes separate, and because C and CS mount type is common, that means that there's an endless array of lenses that are compatible with this. So the cost of those could be, probably from the cheap to very expensive. Oh, and the last thing I'll mention is that for the 2 standard cameras, the lens is it's a fixed focus lens, so you can't adjust the focus in any automated way. But there is a $1 plastic tool you can buy from adafruit.com that lets it, it's like a little wrench that grabs the lens, and you can turn it clockwise or counterclockwise to dial in the focus that you'd like in your system.
I highly recommend getting this thing because turning the lens is a lot harder than it looks. So if you use like tweezers or pliers or something, I think I have destroyed maybe, I would say, half a dozen cameras trying to use tweezers, and I scratched the lens so badly that I can't take a picture with it anymore. So highly recommend this $1 piece of equipment. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you've ever heard horror stories about adjusting the focus of the Raspberry Pi cameras, it's because in the old 5 megapixel cameras, the lens was glued in and you had to break the seal. The new ones actually don't come glued, so that they're easier to adjust with this tool.
Yeah, and I believe this tool works with the V1 and V2 cameras. I believe they work for both of them. So in case you happen to have an older version, I think it does work.
Hello, guys, there is a question for you. Which filter in the NOR camera can make it?
Right, good question. There could be a more official way to get a visible light cut filter, but the Newsnell Labs, they were clever and they just used an exposed piece of film like you would use for, for radiography. Because once it's exposed, it looks completely solid, opaque black, but it doesn't actually block infrared light. So if you put that in front of that camera, it can't see visible light, but only infrared light from that point on.
Okay, thank you, Noah.
And we have a follow-up question as well. What is the name of that device you were talking about to turn the lens?
Oof.
And maybe if you have a moment, could you grab a link and just put it in the comments for that?
Yeah,
or put it in the chat and we'll put it in the comments.
Yeah, I've got it.
I'm not sure if it has an official name.
It's called lens adjustment tool.
There you go.
Yes, very official. Thank you.
I think I've seen like a build for 3D printers. You might be able to get it on the community. I don't know what it's called anymore, but I know there are plans for it, at least so you can 3D print it for yourself if you are so inquired. But.
Okay. And they were also wondering, sorry, there was also another question following up. Is it possible to adjust the focus using the tweezers on the 5 megabyte Pi camera?
Yeah, I think
the big one. That's right.
The adjustment tool will grab the lens of the 5 megapixel camera as well, but you do have to break the glue seal. So I know people like that used to do things like use tweezers to like break the glue seal. There was about a 50% rate of scratching the lens or breaking the camera in some way, but I assume that this wrench would help with that, like breaking the seal, but it will take extra force to do versus the new camera.
Yeah, I say almost 50% is generous. I think every time I tried to do it, I'm almost give myself maybe 75% chance that would break the thing. It is a lot tougher than it looks because that glue is surprisingly tough. So yeah, I would recommend just getting the V2 camera if it's only $25, maybe $30. Highly recommend the upgrade anyway. But the lens, just having that ability to focus it easier is highly worth it. Very much worth it.
There is another one from Fahlgren Smith. What is the blue sheet that comes with the NOR camera for?
Right, it comes with a little transparent blue sheet. And I think they have some tutorials for it. I want to say, actually, am I right in saying you can, I think that's what you can use it for, like, I think you can use it for NDVI. Is that what I'm thinking? I can't quite remember. I haven't used it personally.
Yeah, neither have I.
I can't quite remember. But it was for something like where you take a picture with and without it, and then you can use image analysis to do some type of ratio between the with and without. I have not gone down this route, but there is sort of a practical, or you could get fancy, and if you could include like a mechanical type of filter switching in front of the no-AR camera, you can convert it from, say, an RGB camera with an infrared cut filter to without. And if you can do that, you can actually calculate some indices or, other kind of calculations.
Okay. Thank you, Noah.
Okay. So it looks like my flash is done. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Okay. So we get to this point. It says flash complete. and we are now ready to start up our Raspberry Pi operating system. So we can close this thing down. And this little walkthrough, we gotten through getting the Raspberry Pi OS, we unzipped it, we got it through Etcher. And now we're going to take the card out of your card reader from your machine, and we're going to plug it into the Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to show you what my Pi looks like. So this is my Raspberry Pi. And right there, that's where we're going to slip our SD card into. So the red and black side of my card is showing. So the gold strips. So I'm going to pull it out and show you. So this tiny little SD card has little gold strips on the one side, and then the back side shows all the text and everything. We're going to make sure that those gold strips are facing the board. So it's going to slide in just like that. And we just force it all the way in. Oops, right there. So it looks just like this. Really nice and easy. Just get it in there. And once we have the SD card in, we want to put in all of our peripherals before we power it on. Because if we put in the monitor and then, if we power it on and then plug in the monitor, there's not going to be a screen. Raspberry Pis, they like to have the monitor available whenever the power supply is actually plugged in. So get all your peripherals in. So that's going to be your keyboard, your mouse, and your monitor. Get it plugged into a monitor. And then once we have all of that in, you're going to take your power supply and plug it in. This is how you turn on the Raspberry Pi. There's no switches unless you have a power supply with a switch. Those are kind of fancy. I've never actually used them, but there are power supplies that have a switch. But as soon as you plug in the power, that's when you will turn on the Pi and it'll get started up all automatically. Okay, so I'm going to plug mine in. And the first thing we're going to do is get through the initial setup. And hopefully, your initial setup will look something like this. So it's not going to be exactly like this. So this is my little version of running the Raspberry Pi. So whenever you get started, you'll see a bunch of text there just going down the screen. And eventually, it takes a little while to start up, but there you go. There's your Raspberry Pi desktop. So the purpose of going through all of this is just to show you what happens whenever you first start up your Pi. I'm going to close these. And here we are. Here's our Raspberry Pi. And here's a little welcome screen to get your Raspberry Pi up and running. And it's a really simple setup procedure. We're just going to click Next. Here we're going to set where we are on the planet. So we are in United States at the Dana-Force Center. American English, time zone. We are in the Central Time Zone. Chicago is great. We're in the U.S. We like to use the English language, U.S. keyboard. So wherever you are, select your preferences. It's going to set your location internally. And here's where it's going to require you to input a new password. So the default password, as shown right here, is Raspberry. So every single Pi has the password Raspberry by default. So if you want to make yours a little more secure, rather than somebody automatically knowing your password if you don't change it, highly recommend doing that now. So I'm going to put in a new password and confirm it. I'm going to press Next. And this is where there might be a little change from where you guys are versus where I am. So my Pi is plugged in via Ethernet, so it automatically knows there's a network connection. If you do not have an Ethernet port plugged in, it's going to search via the Wi-Fi for a network connection. So at that point, select your network, input the passcode to access a network and connect to the internet. And when you get through there, you will hit this window here where it's going to say, do you want to automatically install system updates? Highly recommend doing this. It won't be too big of a deal. It shouldn't be a really large download or a really large install process. If you follow the link for the operating system in the walkthrough, because that is the most recent version of the Raspberry Pi operating system that was released. So it should be minimal number of upgrades available. So I'm going to press Next. And it's going to search for the updates, and it's going to install them automatically. Like I said, it shouldn't be a really big install, but highly recommend doing that. And once we get through this process here, your Pi will be all ready to go. And that's all it takes to set up a Pi. It's really, really easy.
Jeff, there are 2 questions if you have time to answer them now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first one is from Lisa. What happens if you use the NOIR camera without a filter? Does it produce an RGB image with the infrared light treated like red light?
Yeah, very good question. So I think Noah mentioned that there's a cutoff filter. And what happens is when you have the no IR camera in visible light, so it's going to capture all of that near infrared light, and it's going to put it in the red channel. So what's going to happen is you're going to get a really pink image. So that's generally what happens. You just blow out the red channel of the sensor itself. So everything's very red and very pink.
Yeah, I saw that Noah already answered. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
And then there is the second question from, so have you ever noticed any of the Raspberry Pi cameras producing image distortion? And if so, how to correct it such that measurements are consistent?
Yeah, absolutely. These cameras are really cheap, right? So the lenses are not perfect by any means. And they vary from camera to camera, at least in my opinion. They're not exactly consistent. So if you get like multiple different cameras, you take the same picture, you might get a fisheye effect in one, or maybe a little less so in another, or more so in another one. This is a pretty common problem. And the solution is camera calibration. So there are 2 different components to camera calibration. There are intrinsic and extrinsic factors. I would just recommend Google searching how to do camera calibration. There are multiple modules out there inside GitHub to do this. I don't believe PlantCV can do it yet, but that's not really the purpose of PlantCV. But again, I highly recommend Google searching camera calibration. You're going to come to a point where you're going to have to print out patterns on a piece of paper, and you're going to take multiple pictures of that pattern. And then the software is then going to create a file, a calibration file, that's going to have the intrinsic and extrinsic camera parameters that you can use to calibrate any camera lens you want to make sure all your measurements are consistent.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's not even specific to the Raspberry Pi camera. You can do that for any camera you want. So if you have a really special hyperspectral or multispectral camera or Raspberry Pi camera, that whole process is exactly the same. You take multiple pictures of some kind of pattern, and you run a calibration algorithm that will detect the pattern and create your intrinsic and extrinsic camera parameters. It's okay. You guys shouldn't have this error. I'm running through a virtual machine, so this is the problem. Don't worry about that one. When it's done, it's going to have you restart. And once you restart, your Pi will be up and ready to go. So you saw how quick that was. So I'm going to press restart now. I'm going to go through a virtual machine. I don't think it's actually going to boot back up. That's okay. I have this is a virtual machine. I actually have my real Pi that I'm going to switch to now. So I'm going to close this and then switch it over to my real Pi. Okay, so this is my Raspberry Pi that I just showed you. Hopefully you guys can see all of that. And it's all done. We're ready to go. To shut down a Pi, it's important to start there because so we have our Pi up and running. When we're done working with it, we need to know how to shut it down safely. So there's a pretty strong inclination to just yank out that power cable. I don't recommend doing that. There's a way to safely shut down the Pi. There's 2 different ways to do it. One, if you're familiar with Terminal, which we're going to go through some of those steps a little later. But just like any operating system, there's a little drop-down menu. So we click this thing, go down to the log out. The window will show up. That's shut down. That's a safe shutdown. And then once you press this button, your screen will go black. And the power that's supplied into the Pi is not actually shut down itself. So what we highly recommend doing is once you shut down the operating system is to unplug the cable. It's going to prevent any unnecessary power going to the Pi while it's not in use. And just as you saw whenever we were started it up, all we have to do is plug the cable back in. So you're going to, if you want to restart your Pi later, you have to unplug it and then plug it back in anyway. It's safer to do this shutdown here, and when you're done, unplug the cable. So that's going to be our recommendation there. So that's how you safely shut down the Pi. To do it in a terminal command, we have sudo shutdown -h and then now. So if you run that in a terminal window right here, you would just type out sudo shutdown -h now. Okay, so let's go through really quickly what this means. Sudo means you have to have authorization to shut down the machine, and all it's going to do is ask for your password that you created during the setup. Shutdown is obviously the command that actually shuts down the machine. -h means safely. So there's different ways to shut down. You can do a forced shutdown, which highly not recommend doing. -h just means safely. And you can schedule this for sometime in the future, or you can do it right now. And that's what the now stands for. And when you have this command typed out, all you do is press enter, and then you'll insert your password and your machine will shut down. So I'm going to close this. Close this. So we got our Pi set up. We got through the initial setup. We got to the desktop, and we are now able to shut it down safely. Okay, so that's what we call the pregame. So this is just getting through the setup all the way down to how to shut it down. I had these notes here. These are just my personal thoughts on why we did the things we did. So what we have installed is the latest version of the Raspberry Pi operating system, formerly known as Raspbian. This is a 32-bit operating system. It's sort of important when you try to develop your own software, but they do have a 64-gigabyte version in beta right now. There's no word on when it's actually going to be released. There's no plans, but at least it's being developed. So the next sentence here is about our tried and true method on actually how to get the operating system onto an SD card. This is non-trivial. The hardware itself is a huge, huge factor. So we highly recommend SanDisk cards and SanDisk readers. I've tried PNY cards for a while. They're slow, and they break actually quite easily. I think I've used a Samsung card as well. Those are great. They're just a little more expensive than SanDisks. So if you want to go down that route, that's totally acceptable there. I would not go, in terms of quality, I wouldn't go underneath the SanDisk. And finally, actually getting the operating system onto the card. There's so many different ways to do this. We used Etcher to do this. It's a really great way to do it. I've had no problems using Etcher. However, I have had problems using your OS disk manager. There's usually some sort of a disk manager in every single operating system, Windows, Mac, and Linux. It works sometimes, not all the time. And it's really hard to debug whenever it doesn't work. In the Raspberry Pi tutorial, they even have a method of using the command line using a command called dd. That was the default method to put on these images onto SD cards from Raspberry Pi for a long time. I have never actually successfully done it. It's a really weird process to get to work, and there's a nickname for dd. So if you are so daring to try dd to flash your ISO onto your SD card, I promise you're not actually so daring to do this. dd, its nickname is actually Disk Destroyer. So I don't recommend using dd. Try to use Etcher if you can. Outside of that, there is a Raspberry Pi flashing program now. I think that's available. I haven't tried it myself, but hopefully that works just as well as Etcher. Outside of that, your OS disk manager is probably just fine. And if you try to use dd, I've never actually gotten it to work. I don't think Noah has it either. But those are the different ways to do it. So what we've gone through today is our most tried and true method, using SanDisk cards, using Etcher, and getting that going. You saw how easy it was to do it all. Okay, so that is the end of pregame. If there's any questions, I just like to take a moment to pause, because there's always questions at this point, at least in terms of getting it set up. But I'll just take a brief pause before we start getting the camera set up. It's a really easy process to get the camera set up, but it's a really cool one nonetheless.
Oh, I'm not muted, sorry. So there's one more question, but it's not necessarily related to Pi setup, but I'll throw it up just in case you have an answer. They're wondering if you know of any long-wave IR cameras that are compatible with the Pi, or if you have any recommendations.
Oof.
Or
I
knowing too.
don't think I know any long-wave IR for Raspberry Pi. At least myself. Maybe Noah might know. I haven't seen anything before.
I mean, I only have direct experience with like FLIR thermal cameras. I guess my general feeling about any kind of specialty cameras like Headwall or FLIR or whatnot is that they tend to only interface with like Windows computers, and because this is a Linux computer, that's going to be a limitation. It's going to have to be something that's compatible with Linux. And then on top of that, Raspberry Pi is an ARM-based CPU, not an Intel-based CPU, and that kind of can further limit software compatibility unless you can kind of build software from source or it's supported on ARM. We did forget to mention that, but this is a good reminder, this question. You can use cameras that are not Raspberry Pi camera modules. We've successfully used like DSLR cameras and point-and-click cameras that are compatible with a software library called gPhoto 2. You can use gPhoto 2 on the Pi to remote control a cabled camera to the Pi if you wanted like a higher quality camera for some applications. Some webcams that work on Linux and plug in via USB are also, I've heard reports that they're compatible, but I tend to use the Pi camera module personally.
Great, okay, and I guess we'll, in this interest of time, just get going on the next section.
Sure. Yeah, one other thing that I do want to mention before moving forward is the network itself. So in order for you to connect to a Pi remotely, you have to have sort of some way to access it. We like to use static IP addresses. So it's a way to log into the Pi from external sources. Google's gonna be your friend here. There are so many different ways to set a static IP address, but that's just a talking point. So when you're going through your own setup and you need to connect to your Pi remotely, very likely you'll have to set up a static IP address. Again, Google's your friend here, and there's so many different ways to do that. Okay, so going into session one. We have our assembled Pi. We turned it on. Here's our we need a camera module. And we need all of our peripherals. Okay, so step one. If your Pi is not powered off, go ahead and do that now. Because when we go to install the camera module, we don't want to short out the circuit or anything like that. So go ahead and shut it down and unplug it. And we're going to go through how to install the camera module itself. Okay, so I'm going to go down here. I have a really big section on how to install the camera module itself. I'm going to point to the picture really quick. Okay, so this is my Raspberry Pi. There's a little slot right here. It's a little black slot, and on the text, it'll say camera. Now, this is where we're going to plug in the ribbon cable that comes with your Raspberry Pi camera, and there's directionality to it. So there's a little blue side of the cable. We want this blue side to face the USB ports over here. Okay, to actually install this ribbon, this little part right here in the black, this is a locking mechanism. What you have to do is very, very carefully lift it out of the slot. It only moves about 1 to 2 millimeters, and it kind of rocks backward just a little bit. If you lift too far, it comes out, and it's really hard to put back in. It's also very brittle. So if you lift one side of it and then you go a little too far on that one side, you might break the mechanism on the other side. And again, very hard to replace. So just be very, very careful. So this is a picture of the mechanism actually disengaged. And it's sort of rocked back a little bit. You can kind of see that there. So when you have it out and disengaged, we're going to slide the ribbon in with the blue side facing the USB ports. And once we have the ribbon cable in with one hand, use the other hand to lock the mechanism back down, and the ribbon cable should not pull out by any means. Okay, so once we have the ribbon cable in, turn on the Pi. So all your peripherals are plugged back in, and start the Pi back up. So I have it here. Start it back up, plug it back in. All your monitors should turn back on. You'll get to your desktop, and just give me 1 second for mine to boot up. But again, it's really, really important that you take great care trying to put in this camera module. For a long time, I actually wasn't recommending removing the locking mechanism out. I was just saying just shove it in there as hard as you can. It doesn't break the module itself, doesn't break the ribbon either, but it takes a little bit extra force, and it's like the safest way to preserve your locking mechanism, because it is extremely hard to replace. Okay, so here's my Pi. I'm gonna log back into it. And now we're here. So once you have your camera module actually installed, it's not ready for use just yet. You have to enable it. And the way we're going to do this is through the menu. So you're going to click your menu right there, go down to Preferences, and Raspberry Pi Configuration. So we get to this point. New window should show up. We're going to go to Interfaces. And by default, the camera module is disabled. So we're going to click the radio button for Enable. You see I have 2 other ones enabled that are not enabled by default. At the very end of this, I'll probably go over VNC. That's how I'm able to create this window and share screen from my laptop and connect to this thing remotely. Additional level of connectivity is through SSH, also not enabled by default. So these are the 3 things I enable the first time I set up a Raspberry Pi. But most importantly for this session, enable the camera. So when you activate these radio buttons, press OK, it's going to have you restart the Pi again to make sure they are enabled. And whenever that happens, we'll get back to this screen. And we're going to take our very first picture. So for anyone following us live, I'll give you like maybe 5 seconds. It's a really quick restart. And then we're going to jump into the terminal and actually issuing the command to take our very first picture. It's really, really easy to take a picture of Raspberry Pi using the camera module. And that command is through raspi still. So this is the executable that we're going to run. It takes a couple of arguments. -o means where we're going to output the picture. So it's going to put it in this pictures directory, and we're going to call it test.jpg. And let's do that now. So open the terminal. We're going to do raspi still -o. Actually, I'm going to put myself onto the desktop real quick. So raspi still -o. I'm going to call it test.jpg. So we run this command, your camera module will activate. So there's a little red light that's going to show up on your module, and that's going to be like it's an internal calibration, and eventually your camera is done taking the picture, and voila, we have a test picture. Let's take a quick look at it. Mine is upside down, so that's not very helpful, but there's ways to flip it around. So I'm going to close this. If you arrow up on your keyboard, you repeat the same command. So I'm going to just dial back just a little bit, and I'm going to put -VF, which means vertical flip, and run it again. Oh, why not? Oh, sorry, dash. There, we need that -O after. So -VF first, -O test. And it's going to flip your picture around, and it'll make it in the right orientation. Okay, so let's take a look again. And now you can see my lovely home with all my board games, and this is what we have. So that's a really easy way to take a picture. So you saw that was a manual way to take a picture. And for high throughput or automated imaging, we need a way to label our image, not test. What's really, really common is to have in your file name the time it was taken. So in the Google Doc that we have available for you all, we have a way to do this with a bash script. So this is a link that takes you to a nice Raspberry Pi camera tutorial. So if you follow this link, it's the same thing we just went through, raspi still -o. We call it test for our purposes. When we go down a little further, it teaches you how to do a vertical flip and a horizontal flip, just like we did. And lastly, let's create a program or a script that we can execute that will take our picture with a timestamp in it. So the way we do this is in our terminal here, to make a new file, we're going to say touch. In this tutorial, they call it, I'm not even sure what they call it, camera.sh. So when we do this, it makes a new file. You see it's right there on the desktop. Now we have to add stuff to it. I like to use a really simple editor. It's called Nano. So we're going to do nano camera.sh. So we go to here, and you press enter. This window shows up. And what we're going to do is you have to tell the Raspberry Pi how to execute this text file. So we're going to, it's a sh file, so it's got a shell file or a shell executable. We have to insert the very first line. This is called a shebang. I actually don't know why it's called a shebang. Maybe it's the hashtag !bang. I have no idea. So it's $/bin/bash. So it tells the program that it's a bash executable. The next step is to tell it how to define the date. So I'm just going to bring this over here so I can type it all out. So we're going to make a variable called date. If you just follow exactly what's written in there, we're going to create a way to tag on the date into the file name. So the Y means the year. We're going to do it in one format of the year. The %M is the month. %D is the day. And we're separating by these different characters, the hyphen and the underscores. The hour and the minute. And you see that it recognized that this is going to be a variable. So the next line, we're going to tell it how to use the date variable that we just created. So we saw how to execute the Raspberry still command. I needed the VF for mine. If you need the HF for yours, go ahead and do it. And the output, I'm going to put mine in the home Pi desktop. That's where I was putting my pictures before. $date, that's how you call the variable that we created above, .jpg. Simple as that. So we have this script made. It's not saved yet. The way to save this script, we're going to do Control O. And it's going to say write name to file camera.sh. Press enter. And it says wrote 5 lines. And then to close this, Control X. And now we're back to here. One little command that shows you where we are is called ls. That's list all of the files, everything in our current directory here. I'm in the desktop. So we have our camera.sh, but right now it's a text file. We have to tell it it's a program. That's what this next line of this little tutorial is all about. So change mod tells the computer that it's an executable program. Camera.sh. Now we do ls. Now all of a sudden the text is green for camera.sh. To run the program, /camera.sh. We execute it. Your camera will turn on, just as we did with the Raspberry still. It'll take the picture. And in my desktop, I now have a new file with a date stamp for our image. Open it up, and it should be the same picture we just took. But now in the file name, it has the date. So this is really crucial for time-lapse imaging, because if you don't do this, you're going to overwrite your test image over and over and over again. That's not helpful. So this is the common method that we use to do time-lapse imaging. Okay, so we have this program called camera.sh. To put it on a timer to actually do time-lapse imaging, we're going to use a executable, or maybe a program or scheduler called cron. In our little tutorial, I recommend using a tool. It's actually quite an old tool. It's called Cron Tab Guru. So I'm just going to go to it really quick. And this isn't really particularly helpful here just yet, but the idea is we're going to execute the camera.sh program at some interval. And the way that interval is defined is through these 5 characters separated by spaces. The first character refers to the minute. The second character is the hour, the day, the month, and the day of the week. So, month. Oh my gosh. Minute, hour, day, month, year is usually how it works. So the reason Concept Guru is really great is it has a bunch of really quick examples when you go down here. So if you want to schedule something every minute, or every 1 minute, every 3 minutes, or maybe every day at 2 in the morning, or every Friday, all you have to do is click one of these things and it'll tell you exactly the scheduling that you have to insert in your cron. So let's show you what cron actually looks like. So to make a new timer, it's cron tab -E. The first time you fire it up, it's going to ask you which editor that you want to use. So we've already used Nano. I highly recommend using Nano to do simple editing. So you just type in 1 and press enter. So this is a pre-populated file. It already exists. And all you have to do is put in the timing. So if I want to do, let's see, what did I say? Let's do every hour. So this is every hour at the top of the minute. So every 0 minute, every hour. If you put in a 10 here, that's every hour at the 10-minute mark, for instance. So we go over here. We're going to do 0, star, 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 star. Because that's exactly how it's written out here. So this is the timing. And if you want to execute, now we have to tell it what to actually execute. So we're going to do home, pi, desktop, camera.sh, because that's where that file lives. And again, it's not saved yet, so we do Control-O, enter, Control-X. And when we finish that, it's a cron tab says it's installed a new cron tab, and now our timer is set. So at the top of every minute, or at the top of every hour, the 0 minute, this camera is now going to activate and take a picture. So my time here is 11:32. So I'm going to go back to this, and I'm going to set my timer for at the 33rd minute. So hopefully I can catch it before it fires off. And whenever this minute hits 33, my camera should activate. It's going to take a picture and save it to my desktop. So that's how you schedule for time-lapse imaging. I see my camera module just turned on, so hit the 33rd minute. And there it is. Took a picture with the timestamp at 11:33. And now at every 33rd minute, every single hour, this camera module is going to fire off. So that's how you schedule automatic time-lapse imaging. It's really, really easy, as you can see. It's going back to the tutorial here. That's where we end. It's setting up a cron tab. We made our script to take the picture, our cron tab to do the scheduling. And this last little bit here is all the different camera parameters that are available to you with the Raspberry Pi module. So if you follow this link, this here is the documentation on the Raspberry Pi website of all the amazing things you have control over. Oops, sorry. This one here, that's the one I was going for, camera parameters. These are all the different things that you have control over. There are tons of things you can do. You can adjust the opacity, the sharpness, contrast, brightness, exposure. There's different metering. There's automatic white balancing. There's all kinds of different things you can do. All kinds of different things. You see how far down, I'm only like halfway down this page. There's so many different things you can change by hand. So going back to here, this is the Raspberry still command that we use in our Danforth Plant Science Center growth chambers. This is what we have figured out to be the optimum camera settings to not overexpose the image, also not underexpose the image. And we have to do the vertical flip, horizontal flip. This -Q means the image quality. And fun fact, the image quality by default is not 100%. So highly recommend changing your camera quality to 100%. And we have the default the default metering, which is used by the camera module to detect what the exposure should be. is centered around the very center of the image. So if you have a really bright white spot right in the middle of your image, you're going to underexpose your image and whenever it's captured. So the matrix metering means look at the entire image in little chunks to identify what the optimum exposure and shutter speed are. So we like to use matrix metering. ISO is all about the exposure. So we slightly drop down the ISO levels. This SS is shutter speed. So there we can we can manually set how fast the camera should acquire. And then finally, our output is the same thing we just went through, that date with the formatting. And this little $ host name. So this is if you have different Pis taking, running the same command, you can identify which Pi took the picture. So with the $ host name. So that's pretty much all we have to get started with using the Raspberry Pis and getting the camera module set up and getting a timer set up for automatic time-lapse imaging. And I do have some little bit of notes down here. Like I said, there's tons of things you can do with the Raspberry Pi. I mentioned this earlier. If anything you want to do, I almost guarantee you're not the first one to do it. Google is your absolute best friend here. The Raspberry Pi community is super supportive. So 9 times out of 10, you can find exactly what you're looking for. Maybe not all the way what you're looking for, but very, very close. So there's different camera parameters that you can play with, specifying the mode, the gains, if you want more green in your image, or for some reason your lighting isn't necessarily ideal, you can modify what the picture is able to capture with the RGB gains. Similarly, the brightness, contrast, all those things. Raspberry Pi has automatic white balancing built in. It does take a couple of different parameters to turn it off if you want to have really high control over if you do have high control over your environment, you can turn it off and input your camera speed, ISO, and your exposure. You have to set all of those things if you turn white balance off. One last little bit here is sort of a really fun, like the fun fact that I showed you about the quality. That's not 100%. The camera module, at least in my experience, it never fully saturates at 255. So a picture, an 8-bit picture, the pixels range from 0 to 255. That's how an image is captured. In the Raspberry Pi camera module, I've noticed that it saturates, or it never really goes over 236. So just a little warning as you're taking pictures, trying to figure out what's saturating your pictures. 236 seems to be the upper limit of what the module is able to capture. And lastly, I mentioned sort of networking. If you want to take a picture on a Pi that's not necessarily accessible, or you don't have a monitor, keyboard, and mouse hooked up to it, you can get to your Pi through SSH and run the same commands via terminal to take a picture. And I mentioned this before, you need an IP address. So whenever you're setting this up on your own, maybe local network or through your institution, you might have to get in touch with your IT department to get a static IP set for your Raspberry Pi, so you know how to access your Pi whenever you need to. Because generally what happens when you plug a new device to a network, it's automatically assigned an IP address that's determined from a router. And that IP address is going to change each time you turn on your device. So if you know your IP address one time, you turn it off, turn it back on, you probably won't get that same IP address again. So you have to talk to your network administrator to set a static IP address so you know how to get to your Pi each and every time. That is about it for our session. We just wanted to make a couple notes on other uses for Raspberry Pis. We are highly resourceful in terms of the image processing, but there's other things you can do with Raspberry Pis. In particular, Noah mentioned that there's GPIO pins. So there's ways to connect sensors to your Raspberry Pi to capture that information. I do want to point out there is a Raspberry Pi Sense hat that has a bunch of sensors built in onto this like little chip, and you plug it right into the Raspberry Pi, and it'll detect your light, humidity, temperature. There's a little accelerometer to identify if the Raspberry Pi is moving, and it can capture all that information. You can write it to a file, whatever you want to do. It's a really easy way to get a sensor on board to your Raspberry Pi. And lastly, I did want to mention that you've probably noticed that I have Raspberry Pi right here, but this part right here is my laptop or my computer, and I'm able to go back and forth really easily. So what you guys have set up is your Raspberry Pi setting on a monitor separate from your main computer. This is a really nice way to access your Raspberry Pi desktop from a remote computer, namely like my laptop or your own desktop or your own laptop. It's really easy to enable this service. It's actually back here in your Raspberry Pi preferences that we went through already. When you get to the interfaces menu, it's this VNC. I have mine enabled so I can do this. If you want to do this yourself, that's all you got to do is enable VNC on your Raspberry Pi. And you have to get the VNC software on your own laptop. And that's how I'm able to connect to it from my own remote machine here. And I have a link here to download that software so you can run it on your own machine. And it's really easy. Just get it installed. It'll ask for the IP address, it'll ask for this address up here. And that's the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. All you got to do is put in that Raspberry Pi IP address and insert the password. And now you have a remote desktop. Later in this document, we're not going to go over this information in this session, but in the components list that was listed above, you can go through these a sensor tutorial yourself. We also have a circuit tutorial, but I do have really big bold red here. It's a very strong warning that if you're not familiar with building your own circuits, you have to take special steps to make sure you're not going to burn your Pi, like physically burn it up. If you supply more voltage or amps than what's expected, you will destroy your Pi. So all these different tutorials go through all the way down to make your own circuits. This is a program that puts a button on a board, and when you click it, it takes a picture, just like a normal camera. And then finally, at the very last here, other microcomputers to consider. So Noah already went over a lot of this stuff. Other Pis, the 3B Plus is one, 4 is another. But we also mentioned Pi Zeros, the 0W, and different older modules. Arduino was also already mentioned, and later in these series, we'll see some examples of using Arduino. Basic Stamp is a notable mention. It's really old, but it is still useful. And lastly, the NVIDIA Jetson that was also mentioned that does GPU computing on board. So that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed going through the Raspberry Pi tutorial, and hopefully you'll be able to do time-lapse imaging on your own in your own fancy setup, whether it's through a really highly controlled environment, through a goat chamber, or maybe your own garden out back if you want to put it up on like a stick or something and monitor your own plants over time. Hopefully this is a helpful tutorial, and look forward to seeing your projects. So I'm going to stop sharing now and get back here.
The one last thing I'd mention is we're not really set up in this tutorial to show you, but you have different options to get the image data. So one is if you didn't have a network connection, you can just save the images to the SD card for potentially a long period of time. You know, the bigger your SD card, the more images you could collect. But certainly days, weeks, maybe even a month, depending on how frequently you're taking pictures. But if you do have a network connection, the way we do it is using a program like SCP or rsync. You can transfer the data to another computer automatically, and you could set that up within cron, just like you did the recipe still command, so that you could just automatically transfer the images whenever they're captured. rsync in particular is really nice because it can be configured to synchronize the data to another computer, where it checks to make sure that the file was transferred intact. And you can also configure it, or we typically do, to remove the image from the Pi after successful transfer to another computer. Then you don't have to worry about your SD card filling up, and your images are safely put onto, say, a server where you're going to do image analysis.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Wow, such amazing presentation.
Yeah, very great.
Thank you for putting all these together and sharing with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Yeah, I have a small question. Like, do you guys know if Raspberry Pi have been used also in the field? Because so far we have been mostly in the greenhouse. So, for example, if someone wants to build, okay, there are many solutions in the field that you can use also for doing time lapse. But I mean, if do you guys know any example of that? Is like they can be useful, or they are also there are some challenge in that based on the light and everything.
Yeah, let me. I'll look up the Patch Novels group has probably the most sophisticated setup I've seen with solar-powered Raspberry Pis. I believe maybe they were doing a couple different things, but one of them was looking at setting maze anthesis by having the cameras pointed up at the maze tassels. But that was all Raspberry Pis. I can find that paper.
Yeah, so actually on that same note, whenever you put something out in the field, you have to protect it a little bit. So you need to have a case that's sort of more or less weatherproof. However, Raspberry Pis are extremely resilient. We actually have a researcher in a group here at Danforth Center that came from, I think it was in the New England area, where he was using Raspberry Pis in the field, and somehow they fell off of whatever they're doing it through a rainstorm, and it was literally caked in mud. So what they did was to clean them is they hosed them. They just literally took a hose and sprayed the Raspberry Pi and turned it back on, and it was just fine. So they actually are highly resilient because they're pretty low voltage systems. So if it gets wet, it might short out, but these things are very highly resilient. I love that story of just taking a hose and just squirting off the mud. I think that's great. These things are really highly resilient. But like in a growth chamber or maybe a greenhouse facility, what we like to do is we take like a little binder sheet, like a little clear plastic transparent sheet, and we just cover the top of the pie to separate it from the misters or any kind of watering regimes that are implemented in the greenhouse or growth chamber, just to protect it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's very useful, because like, especially where I'm from a tree background, and I'm like, yeah, it's very difficult to follow a tree in the greenhouse. And so it will be interesting if you can also build something outside and like trying to follow the tree in the field directly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we have another 10 minutes of questions. If you guys that are watching now, you can start typing your question here on the chat, and then we're going to share and with our speakers today. I do have one question. I don't know if you guys know, but I like to work with drones. You guys know anyone that is trying to make a drone or some small flying tool that's really how can I say cheap for buying or make? I guess I don't believe if I can believe in something that I can make that can fly, but just in case you guys have some idea.
It's a good question. I don't know anyone that is personally, and I don't trust myself as an engineer to build a flying device.
Yeah, likewise. I wouldn't do that either. Maybe the consideration there, because drones, they're highly weight dependent. So Raspberry Pi 4s, they're a little heavier. You might need to go with like a Pi 0W because they're really small, really light. But that'd be that's my first thought, and probably my only thought, because I have no idea how to make one of these things. Maybe the additional thing you need to consider is how to connect to it, like the actual networking. I think I have found some tutorials on hooking up like the Verizon cellular service to connect to it. So maybe that's something that you would have to do for like a drone, because you have to connect to it remotely. If you're using the field, you have to a way to control it in that kind of environment where there's no necessarily internet connection or like a Wi-Fi connection. You have to have some sort of cellular connection to do that. I'm pretty sure there are tutorials out there that can enable cellular service and connectivity to a Raspberry Pi.
We have a question. Oh, no, go ahead, Claire.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I know one of the first problems we encountered using Raspberry Pis were trying to make a field platform. One of our first problems was we didn't realize there wasn't an internal clock, and as soon as we left our Wi-Fi connection.
Oh yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, actually.
Okay, so Question from the chat. Are there any resources or tips for connecting the Pi to an encrypted Wi-Fi site, such that they have at universities?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing special about it in the sense that the Pi's Wi-Fi will support like standard encrypted Wi-Fi connections, but you have to configure the network to connect to that network. So you're going to have to supply the password. This actually gets into a couple of things that I forgot to mention too. Once you so you set up a Raspberry Pi, you install the operating system, you configure the network. Rather than having to do that on every Pi, if you're going to have multiple of them running, you can clone the SD card, and there's tools to do this, like RPI clone. This is something you're doing outside the Pi. You just take the SD card and plug it into your computer, and you can make an image of your SD card. And then, just like Jeff showed, you can use Etcher then to take your cloned image rather than the one from Raspberry Pi and copy that onto a bunch of different Pis. So you can save yourself a lot of time by doing configuration on one and then just copying it onto all the others. The Pis are very forgiving about using an SD card from one in another. But for the networking, it could be a challenge depending on your institution, just because of the things Jeff mentioned, like you're likely going to want to know the address of it, and so if it's dynamically assigned, that can be difficult. So at our institution, the IT department is willing to assign a static address to each of our Pis. We give them the hardware address of the Wi-Fi adapter or the Ethernet adapter, depending on which one we're using. They'll store that in the Danforth Center level network and give us a permanent address route. If you're at like a university, I could imagine that it might be more difficult to get that from your university level IT department. But what you might be able to do is set up a private network, so maybe have your own router with all of the Pis connected to it, have that connected to your university network. And as long as you could get one computer with a static route that can also talk to that network, that could be sort of your hub that you could log into and then get into your private network from there. I mean, unfortunately, there's probably many many different versions of that kind of setup. Hard to cover them all, but yeah. Jeff, I don't know if you have any other tips there, but
yeah, I've set up local networks. Depending on the size of what you need to do, you might need to have multiple routers or multiple switches or something like that. But if it's your first time doing anything networking, it's not for the faint of heart. I like to use switches. They seem to be easier than setting up routers. So I usually have like one master Pi that I put out in the greenhouse, and I have like several other Pis connected to it via a local switch. And I usually set those static IPs from there, and I just do it myself. It's a really easy way to do it. Additionally, a really nice way to, instead of setting your own static IP addresses, is on the Pi itself, is to create a host name. So that way, when you're on your master Pi, you know how to connect to whatever additional Pi that's connected to it. But if you don't know the IP address itself, you can call it by the host name. So you'll have to set that host name on each Pi separately. So if you want to set up your cloning idea of cloning SD cards multiple times, you have to go through each of those Pis and set the host name individually. That's just one extra level of configuration, but it's a really nice way, and that's what we like to do. Well, it's what I like to do, is set up host names.
The one other thing I'll add is Wi-Fi can be really convenient because, of course, there's no cable, so it's wireless. But I've seen setups where there's basically too many Pis in one area, and the Wi-Fi interference can be problematic and crash your network. It's also just inherently going to be slower than Ethernet. So I guess for me personally, I conceptually like the idea of a wired connection over wireless connection. It's just way more robust. But of course, running potentially hundreds of Ethernet cables is also not an easy task either. So you kind of have to balance that setup. I found Wi-Fi works just fine in say a region growth chamber with 12 highs, maybe even a bigger one with 24. That kind of setup seems to be okay with Wi-Fi, but yeah, if you're we had a greenhouse with hundreds, and the setup is very difficult on Wi-Fi.
Okay, we have another question here. Has anyone had luck collecting data, temperature, humidity from Bluetooth device on PI?
I haven't done it through Bluetooth.
All the newer Pis do have built-in Bluetooth, though.
Yeah.
So conceptually,
yeah, conceptually, okay. I think it would probably work. The Sense Hat has all that stuff on board, so if you have a Sense Hat, you just put it on there and do it. I've had luck connecting those types of sensors to Arduino.
Okay.
Not necessarily Raspberry Pi, but I have connected to Arduino actually through Bluetooth. So you just have to get the MC05 chip or the HC05 chip. And those are really delicate. I've broken like 3 of them. And anyway, so the HC05 is the great way to go. It's a really cheap Bluetooth module, maybe $5. I have connected to Arduino. It's pretty easy.
Yeah, the good thing to work with this technology is, okay, if you broke up $1 thing, your PI, your boss, not gonna say, "Come on, do it." You, what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point too. If you're gonna do a big setup, like with anything else, I do recommend starting small. Buy one and get used to it. I don't recommend bulk buying 100 and then starting big.
There is let's say the last question. What lenses do you suggest for high quality Pi camera?
I think Jeff and I haven't used it, so I have a hard time saying. I will say, so I actually get, from an image analysis perspective, I get this question a lot, like how big of a camera should I buy? And 12 megapixels is okay. The only thing I caution with bigger cameras is I have a collaborator who has a 50 megapixel camera, and it's a great camera, but from an image analysis perspective, that's 50 million data points that I have to deal with per image, and that makes the image analysis really slow. Mm-hmm. Again, 12 is okay, but 8 megapixels is actually pretty good from an image analysis computing perspective. Though certainly the lens on the cheap camera modules is not as good as the lens you would get on a high quality one. Well, I mean, depending on the lens you get, of course. So, there is the image sensor size, but optics, of course, is also important.
Yeah, I think the idea of the newer module is that we can have OEM lenses that aren't necessarily supported or created by Raspberry Pi, but other companies can create their own special lenses to do special things, and that really is the point of making that special module. Yeah. So it's all about your setup and what you want to capture.
Yeah, and then you could start that gives you the opportunity to also to think about, do you want a wide angle lens, a macro lens? Is some sort of optical zoom important for your setup?
Yeah, highly dependent on your setup and what you want to capture.
Yeah, that's great, guys. Thank you so much. Almost 2 hours. We are getting at the end of our workshop today. Thank you, everyone that is there. And thank you for coming. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I want to say that I want just to say that if you guys have still questions for Noah and Jeff, you can reach them anytime, also through our Slack channel. So there is a channel called Raspberry Pi, so you can click there if you have any question.
Yeah, definitely. And feel free to reach out. My
Mhm.
email address is nfahlgren@stanfordcenter.org, or I'm on Twitter @Fahlgren. So,
Yep. Awesome.
thanks
Thank you,
for
guys.
watching, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah. We do now have our end part, and let's use this opportunity for Claire introduce herself.
Yes.
Great, yeah. So I'm happy to be helping out a little bit. I am a technician at Phenomics Lab in Ottawa at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and I'm working mostly with soybean and winter and spring wheat. And we use our ground-based platform right now, but we're looking into maybe getting into drones as well. So it's great to be a part of the community and learn a bit more of the tools. But
Awesome.
at this point, we can talk about what's coming up, because this isn't the only great workshop that Philippe and Anarita have put together. So next week is using the TerraRef high throughput sensor collected plant data in R, and that's with Krista Reamer and David LeBauer. So that'll be on the same channel next week at 10 a.m. And the registration link is down below. If you've signed up for this one, you don't need to sign up again. You're signed up for the email list and you'll get the updates. And I highly suggest signing up just in case one of our other future workshops are of interest to you, because you'll just get all the links and you can come to the ones you're interested in and pass them on. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. It was a really great chat. Thanks again to Noah and Jeff.
Yeah, thanks Claire for joining us. And yeah, thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you guys back again next week. Same
Yes.
time, same place.
All right. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you for being here today. Next week, same time, same day, Friday, hands-on. Yeah, we are really excited for the next workshops as well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.